Hello and welcome to another episode of the AIGA Design Podcast. My name is Lishan Huang, Senior Director of Programs and Learning here at AIGA, the Professional Association for Design.
Hello, everyone. My name is Giulia Donatello. I am the Design Competitions and Event Manager at AIGA.
Hi, everyone. Marta Foresti, founder and CEO of LAGO Collective and visiting Senior Fellow at ODI Global and Moleskine Foundation.
And hello, everyone. I'm Federica Fragapane, and I'm an independent information designer.
Thank you both for joining today. We are excited to learn more about your journey and about LAGO Collective as well. I know that LAGO Collective is a research and creative collective on migration, culture, and the arts. So I'm curious if you can share a little bit of how your journey led to you both to work in the intersection of migration, culture, and arts.
Okay, let me start since LAGO Collective is my brainchild and my fault, so I might as well explain where it's coming from. LAGO has been in my head for some time. It has only existed for the last couple of years. It was founded in the fall of 2022. I come from a very different background. I worked for all my career as a policy expert, researcher, analyst, mostly working on public policy, both in governments, for example, at the Ministry of Finance in Italy, in NGOs like Save the Children, and most recently at ODI Global, which is a large global affairs think tank. And I worked on all sorts of different issues in my career. But since 2015, I started focusing more and more on migration as a phenomenon, particularly in relation to people crossing borders globally, and particularly across so-called the global south or low and middle-income countries, as well as the trajectories towards high-income countries. And that's when I started to worry. I started to worry that putting so much effort and emphasis and sort of personal commitment to research and data and analysis, trying to inform the public debate on the reality of migration, was just falling on deaf ears. Right? It was just not working. There was something that it wasn't cutting through. Not only that, I actually started to feel that it was beginning to hurt, that it was, that every time there was a statistics or a very compelling story about the realities of people on the move, that very quickly turned into, played into the hands of the very well-known toxic narrative that we see playing, particularly during electoral campaigns on our media. As I was worrying and also thinking that the whole so-called infrastructure of the international community that rests on this idea that there is a rich global north and a poor global south, and trying to interpret the movement of people mainly through this lens, through those in need, those who need protection, and frankly, taking away agencies from these people, COVID struck, and the story of the absolutely essential role of migrant workers in our economies and societies became increasingly well known. But in the very early stages of the pandemic, in the spring of 2020, I started to collect data and stories about the contribution of migrant workers to the COVID response. And I had this instinct, really, this intuition that rather than trying to write a report about it or try to use my traditional toolbox of a researcher and analyst to tell the story, the time had come to try to do something different. And that's when Federica comes into the scene, because that's when I contacted Federica and said, I got some data and a story to tell. What do you think? And so let me maybe ask Federica to take it from there in terms of how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, so as I was mentioning, I'm an independent information designer. I've been working in this field since 2012, as a freelancer since 2015. And I've always had the passion of using my tools, of using data visualization, visual languages, the visual languages that I use that are often also experimental, to talk about topics I care about. The first time I talked about migration through data visualization was in 2016. It was my first year as a freelancer, and I decided that I wanted to use my competencies to talk about migration, and especially to talk about the journeys of asylum seekers. I live in Italy, and I was very frustrated about the discourse around migration, about there is a lot of focus on the Mediterranean Sea route in Italy. There still is. Understandably so, because it's very dangerous. But before that part, there are often thousands of kilometers spent traveling, hundreds of days spent traveling. And I really wanted to tell these stories using directly the voices of the people who were doing such travelings and who were living such experiences. So in that year, I went in a welcoming center in Italy, and I proposed to some of the people who hosted there to create a project, to work on a project able to tell their stories and their journeys through data visualization. The project is called The Stories Behind the Line. It's an old one, a relatively old one, but it's still one of the projects I'm most fond of. And it's a visual narrative of their journeys. And so that was the first time I used data visualization to talk about migration. I did it other times before working with Marta. And then in 2020, Marta and I was just following each other on Twitter at the time, something like that. And I remember that I received a direct message in which she just told me, as she mentioned, I have this data, I would like to tell a story. It was March 2020. April 2020, something like that. And I immediately accepted, because her story was a story I wanted to contribute in telling. So that's how we met, and we worked together on this project that is called Key Workers. I co-designed it in collaboration with Alex Piacentini. He's a designer and developer. And we used this project to bring these stories of contribution to life. We designed these trees, one for geographical area, because the research that Marta on ODI's team were doing was collecting the stories of migrant essential workers' contribution. And they had this very rich data set full of stories grouped by continent and by sectors. And we created these trees, one for each world region, in which all the branches are the sectors and all the fruits are stories of contributions. And it's a project in which the users can just lose themselves, clicking on the different branches, clicking on the different fruits. We didn't want to prove necessarily a point to say, I don't know, in Africa, there is this number of stories. We just wanted people to read these stories in no specific order. And that's what the project does. And something that is very important, I think, for both of us, is that it was periodically updated for years, actually. I mean, it's something that we kept on working on for a lot of time. And it was just the beginning of my collaboration with Marta.
Well, thank you, Marta and Federica, for giving us some of the context and previewing a bit of your work. For our listeners who are listening in audio podcast form, we are now doing video for this podcast as well. So we'll be able to show some examples of the work. You can check it out at the AIGA Design channel on YouTube. But I wanted to connect now our conversation to the theme of the podcast this season, which is design and performance. And we see your work is really intertwined with this topic of performance and all of the different definitions, of all the different meanings of this word performance. So could you share a little bit about how you perceive the role of performance as you navigate this practice of data visualization and storytelling around migration?
Let me actually connect what you just said about performance to picking up the story that Federica and I have just been telling, because of course we came to the spring of 2020, and as I said, LAGO was really only born in 2022. But the performance is key to what happens next in this story, because what I learned as a researcher, really working with a designer like Federica, was precisely the power of design to produce knowledge, not just to represent the data, not just to do beautiful images and signs, but to effectively take the data, which is raw material, right? And weave into that raw material a story, an imagery, a vocabulary, actually words and visual words, the way Federica calls them, that I was personally blown away by not just by their beauty, but by their performance, as in what they were actually doing to the story. That, just for clarification, in the early stages of the pandemic, this idea that migrants were valuable contributors to the response and to our societies and economies was actually relatively new. And actually, if you think about it, it hasn't lived much further once the emergency passed. The first thing that comes to mind in relation to performance is design performing in front of my eyes something very different to what I'd been used to. So much so that fast forward a couple of years, and also through other collaborations and work around textile and fashion, I actually thought, there is something in this, right? There is something in this that is not just a sidekick, is not just a little bit of communications that goes hand in hand with research. There is actually a potential to perform more, to create new, to create new work, to create new ideas, new conversations. And so that's the first thoughts around performance, is almost really expanding the space of how data, knowledge, analysis can perform, particularly in the public discourse and in public narrative. And the other idea about performance I have, it goes to the very personal. It relates to performing and an act of performance. And that's actually what we do in LAGO. 2 weeks ago, we were in a beautiful space here in London at the All Other Passports annual event, The Beauty of Movement 2024, where effectively we performed, Federica, myself, Lem Sisse reading his poems, and Tiziana Locci performing her sound. So LAGO has become a performing organization. I'm a dancer. I study contemporary dance, and I relate to performance in that way. And I am finding immense joy in putting out those performances for people to see and to enjoy and to savor and to relate to. So it really resonates with my old self that was always after hard evidence of what works and performance from that perspective, as well as to my inner self that relates to rhythm and dance and performances on stage.
Yeah, and I think Marta and I never talked about that, but I also have a similar background, not in dance, but in theater. I've been doing theater as an actress and also director, not a professional one, but for many years. And I think that this part of my past has a very deep impact on my approach to design, because, when you act or you are on a stage, every single aspect is very important in your relationship with the audience. The tone of voice, every single shades. I mean, I really see the balancing of voices and gestures and small elements. They have a huge impact on the relationship with the audience. And I think that there is something similar to design. I really craft with a lot of care each single detail of my visualizations, and I really see them as the visual equivalent of text, of writing, but also of acting, of speaking. And for me, designing is really a communication act. I always want to speak to someone, to an audience. Then there are different kind of audiences. Sometimes there are policymakers, but pretty often my audience are just people who are browsing through a magazine or a website or are visiting an exhibition. And for me, working with care on also the aesthetics of my pieces and not only the contents. Aesthetics and contents for me are equally important. It's really a way of performing, of telling stories through the data, through the contents, and then through the visual representations.
Yeah, I wanted to pull out some of the themes that I'm hearing from you both. And one is just what you were saying now, Federica, about the shared vocabulary and metaphors between information design and performance, when we use terms like, rhythm and repetition and gesture. All of these things could be performed with our bodies or our instruments, but also with graphics. And then what Marta was saying earlier about this idea of design adding value as creating knowledge. And it's not just how you package the research done by other people and package the statistics at the end. It's really an integral part of maybe visualizing, but also surfacing new insights that maybe were lost or kind of under the surface, when we just have the text or just have the data. My follow-up question to this is really about how you tackle the advocacy part of this, because your work is not just to inform people, but to really advocate for migrants and on the topic of migration. So how do you measure your impact or your performance, to use the theme? Like, how do you know if a project is successful, or what are ways that you measure that in terms of the feedback loop?
First of all, let me say, impact is all I care about, right? All of this is about making, however small, but a significant difference and making some headway. And it really comes from a place, and this is the first consideration, of not having impact. There is so much. I actually worked in evaluation for a few years, so even further removed from anything vaguely creative, but where, we get so obsessed about the measurement and the validity and trying to really have the, really proving that we're making a difference. And then when we don't, we don't spend enough time understanding why, right? And really building on what we're going to do different next time. And in a way, the work that I'm doing now with LAGO comes from a place of not having impact. And as I said earlier, of actual worry about, I could have told the stories about, both the qualitative stories about the migrants' contribution to COVID, or some of this more recent sort of quantitative data around visa rejections in other ways until I was blue in the face or like this wall. And yet making absolutely no difference. Like this idea that you create knowledge and somebody will see the truth in a space that is pure fiction, where lies are the currency of the public debate. You insert snippets of truth, of analysis, of reasoning, and they very quickly turned around to other lies and, to the advantage of whatever dominant narrative. So and that's actually, to me, is really important also professionally. And I wrote a little bit about the experience of making this changing at a stage in your career when you've had some experience and you can look back. And so I want to state that this comes from a place of not having much impact and actually not believing anymore that not just that doing research and doing evidence on its own, doesn't make a difference, but also that doing it from a place where you are observing the world from a standpoint of what we understand development to be, what we understand wealth and well-being to be, interpreting the experiences of people from around the globe, was falling short of making a difference. So how does the work of LAGO today make a difference? What is successful? I always picture it in a very simple, but at the same time quite ambitious terms. I have 2 teenage kids who are 16 and I think 13. My eldest daughter, Bianca, she will vote in a couple of years, and Luca in a few more years. I picture, a world or a scenario in the local polling station, where Bianca, Luca, and their friends will go to vote for the first time, and what they will have in their head, the images they will have in their head, the sounds they will have in their ears about who are the people who move. And what moving from one place to another is all about is actually a different story from the one that dominates our understanding in our political campaigns today. So it is actually the impact is to do with the knowledge, with the understanding, and what is when it is successful is where we create a different story, not necessarily a positive story, mind you, and which is why I actually don't see LAGO as an organization that does much advocacy, or at least not in advocacy in the traditional sense that, in terms of campaigning or public big messages. I'm thinking about small messages and actually images, words, vocabularies, where we break down the barrier between us and them, us the people who stay, them the people who move, which is the first bit of fiction that we all tell each other because a number of us have moved between places in our lifetime. And so if I create stories and imagery in future generations who will determine the outcomes of elections or, the state of the world in the future, that will understand the reality and the movement of people as something beautiful, as something normal, as something that relates to them as well as to others, then I would have made a difference. And I measured lots of things in my life, and I'm now trying not to get too obsessed with measuring. But there are things like for example, key workers. Key workers won a number of awards, and then it got exhibited at the V&A in Dundee at the Design Museum, the Scotland Design Museum, as part of their post-COVID exhibition. Now, the fact that this story is being told in a museum is something I never experienced before. And so measurement-wise, the story is now traveling further afield to places that others didn't get to. The work that we've done on visas recently has been covered and continues to be covered on media all around the world, is all over the Nigerian media as we speak. Again, not something I've experienced before. So there is something about going further afield and lasting longer. Federica mentioned earlier about how Key Workers was updated for years and remained live over the years, and the work we do now on visas has a very similar characteristics of being continuously updated and expanded. There is something about the shelf life and the miles that these work travels, that to me speaks to impact, speaks to making a difference, even though I wouldn't for a minute claim that I have necessarily saved lives or made a huge difference. But we are getting there.
I remember the first time I saw the potential in using the language of data visualization to help knowledge and around topics I cared about was in 2016 when I posted the Stories Behind the Line project. That was the project about migrants, asylum seekers' journeys. And that was a project without any commission. I didn't have a huge following at the time, not at all. I was relatively new in the field of design and data visualization. I just posted it online without any expectations, and I was so impressed by how much it was shared and appreciated. I also was intimidated at the time because I was dealing with a very dramatic and personal topic and personal stories of these people through data visualization, through a language that is often perceived as cold. And so I was a little bit scary that people wouldn't have understood my intentions, but they did. And this really moved me. And then this helped me in bringing this project in a lot of events and conferences that sometimes were very technical ones, data visualization conferences, data conferences, design conferences, but I really wanted to push them a little bit more and to also talk about not only the technical aspects of data visualization and design, but also about these stories, these contents. And something that really impressed me was, for instance, how people were shocked to discover the length of such journeys. And so this sense of discovery, this sense of knowledge, as Marta was mentioning, was very important to me. And then during the years, I've been working on projects on commission, such as Key Workers and other projects I worked on with Marta, but also, again, on side projects about topics that I care about. I also worked especially on social media. I started working especially for social media, something that at first I didn't do because I was afraid to be accused of doing performative activism. But then during the years, I saw the potential in that part too. And I have to say that when I work on a project about a topic that I care about, human rights issues, gender issues, and I see that people reshare such projects because in some way they are topic they care about. This is something that is very important to me, not only letting people discover something new, but also knowing that people are using my projects to talk about something they care about. It's an aspect that is very important to me. Maybe sometimes adding their point of view, their perspective to something that I have done. This for me is the impact I hope to work on.
That's so deep. And I'm reflecting on what I heard from you both. And I think the fact that Marta brought how impressed and surprised she was on how the impact of your guys' work reached places that you didn't even think before. It's truly inspiring, I find, and very relevant. And I think, Federica, I actually perceive data visualization not as code, as you had mentioned, because I do think that we need more images, and that I believe that this is an alternative way of expressing data, and at times even more democratic. So, of course, the type of data that you both work with is something that you really need to read and interpret. So there is not, a quick look. But especially when we're talking about, like, we're living the era of attention economy, being able to offer new ways of sharing data, I find it very powerful.
Yeah, thank you. And this is also why I try to work on visual languages that are not necessarily the ones that are most commonly associated through the data visualization language. There is this idea that a scatter plot or a bar chart is immediately understood by everyone, but there are papers that demonstrate how sometimes people don't know how to read the more classical representations because we are not we don't learn how to do it in schools. We learn how to write and to count and to read, but not how to read graphics. And so I think that I also try to visually experiment to work with shapes that maybe are not so classic, but in some ways I use organic shapes, I use soft shapes that can provide a sense of familiarity. Not familiarity with the language of data visualization, but familiarity with what surrounds us more in general. And it is a way in which I try to invite people to look at my representations.
Yeah.
Can I actually come back to very quickly on some of the things that Federica said, particularly about social media and the previous question about impact? Because I genuinely think, as you can imagine, these questions about what difference does this make is recurrent, and is also a little bit a challenge that comes to me, particularly in trying to explain why I have created LAGO and why I think that this new way of working is better or is worthwhile. And the question is always, what difference does it make? And often in relation to, well, okay, you're producing cute things now, right? You're hanging out with cool people, but are you sure this makes a difference? Because Federica mentions social media and how her sort of following has changed, I just want to reflect on also the power of collaborations. So the idea that somebody like me and Federica start to work together, and not just once, but create, a working collaboration where, Federica, for example, has designed the visual identity of LAGO, and we have ongoing work. And the fact that we are here together having this conversation, and that we influence each other's, spheres of influence, like we enter into each other's spheres of influence, is incredibly powerful, because we all talk about how beautiful collaboration is almost for the sake of it. But, creating connections between worlds and people and disciplines that normally wouldn't connect actually amplifies, almost immediately creates new spaces for engagement. So, I could never reach the people that Federica reaches on social media by myself. And it is through Federica, through the work, that the work, as I said, travel further afield. And the people that we had in the room in All Other Passports event 2 weeks ago are people that literally wouldn't meet if there wasn't an opportunity to connect between, let's call it, the world of sort of the international community and public policy, and the world of design and creativity. So, when we think about impact and difference, we always think about projects and products and, down the line. But I think we shouldn't underestimate the potential of having created a space where people have potential to make a difference come together and make more of a difference together.
I'm very curious. I think you both brought a bit of how some of the projects that you have worked with started. I'm also curious to learn more about what happens before the data storytelling is built, so the research aspect of it. And I know that Federica brought initially the story behind the lines example, how the project started. If you can bring more examples of how other projects started, so the research aspect of it. And on top of that, I'm also curious to learn more about, as far as what I've researched of your projects, it seems that it's very quantitative data heavy. I wonder if you also work with qualitative data, and how do you choose what's the best method for each project?
I'll go first. Okay, first of all, a bit like what I said before about advocacy, partly because research has been my natural habitat for many years. The first thing and this to me really matters, is that I see design as research, I see design as knowledge production. So in a way, the research process does not sort of end when the design starts, is an ongoing process. And in fact, most of the things that Federica and I have done together have had that characteristics, where they started with some ideas or indeed some data, but then the evolution of the knowledge production and the data has gone hand in hand with the design process. I think different projects or different ideas, different initiatives have different origins. I mentioned, the way, for example, the research, so quote unquote, happened on key workers, because it's hardly, research in traditional sense, was me, again, it feels like a lifetime ago, but when Twitter was okay and worked, it was me putting out a message out there to Twitter saying, I'm interested in stories unfolding about how in different places in the world, people are adapting and responding to creating space for migrant workers to be active contributors to the emergency response. This was mainly around healthcare and having more people in wards, in COVID wards and all of that. And so that research is links. It was literally a bunch of links of very obscure articles in a local newspaper somewhere in Wyoming where, some emergency legislation was passed to allow asylum seekers who normally, who have a nursing degree rather than working, say, 20 hours a week, they unlocked that ban to allow people to work for longer, for example. So is actually, going back to a question about quantitative, qualitative, was very qualitative. It's just stories, like literally the equivalent of cut off. My grandfather would have, cut it out from a newspaper. And so Federica often shows what she received from me from that work, which is like an Excel full of links of stories. And in fact, that became a research in a traditional way later. So after we did the work with the data visualization and after we started to actually collect the stories and construct through design our narrative around the value and contribution of these key workers, my colleague Claire Kumar here at ODI afterwards produced a piece of research that went back looking at what we knew about the role of essential workers in European economies and how our data visualization became itself a source of data, a source of stories to be able to do the research. So that's an interesting example where, it started with, again, almost like a desire to tell the story rather than doing the research, and then led to research. And then a more recent example, the work that we've done together on visas, again, is not necessarily, it doesn't start with research, but it starts with the desire to know more. And it all started when Leslie Loco was curating the Biennale of Architecture 2 years ago that focused on Africa. And when she mentioned at the opening press conference that a couple of her colleagues from Accra could not be there on that day because the Italian ambassador rejected their visa application. And that's how I started to wonder about what was going on with visas of people who apply for short-term tourist business and tourist visas to Europe. And yes, that research is, then went into more of a quantitative direction, looking at rejection rates and costs, but is now increasingly turning to the stories behind, not dissimilar to the ideal stories behind the line, the stories behind the visas experiences. And in fact, we have recently produced a short documentary with Rocco Radio in Accra that actually captures the individual stories of some of the DJ residents. So there is it's definitely a combination of different kinds of data and research. And in a way, it starts with understanding or actually comes in Italian, intravedere, like seeing in between some spaces a knowledge gap or, something that doesn't add up. And but from the beginning, almost having design as, in the toolbox to then create new knowledge about that lack of knowledge and lack of data. And on lack of data, I hand over to Federica because she speaks wonderfully about the absence of data.
Yeah, absence of data is like a frustration that I have because there is this beautiful book that it's Data Feminism, and I think it's essential for people who want to work in the data visualization field, in the data field in general, but not only. And it's all about the power that stands behind data, the collection of data, who is collecting them and for which reasons, and what are the questions that me as a data visualization designer, but in general, we people who work with data, what are the questions that we need to ask ourselves before using a certain amount of a certain kind of data, and also why there are gaps, why there are missing data, and how can we fill the silences that sometimes stands behind those missing information. And this is something that I try to overcome sometimes by telling personal stories, for instance. It's something that I love doing and I would love to keep on doing. And this is about the part of research. Then there is thinking about the research part, also in terms of design and languages. There is a project that we've done together with Marta Foresti and also again with Alex Piacentini for ODI that it's called Art and Mind. And I really love this project because of the work we have done on visual languages. This is a website about public narratives and attitudes towards refugees and other migrants in European countries. we visualized data that ODI was already working on for years. We visualized reports that were published periodically by ODI. The research part behind this project was all about the languages used to talk about migration. So with Marta, we had a lot of interesting conversations on how migration is often perceived, is often displayed through the metaphors of flows, of these big arrows that are often also associated with the invasion maps, old invasion maps, war maps. And we really wanted to challenge this way of talking about migrations and to find another visual metaphor completely different from these arrows ones, invasion ones. And so we created a project in which the data are visualized through the visual metaphor of mountains, because the creation of the mountains is an inevitable and natural process that is part of our planet history, such as migration is an inevitable and natural process part of our human history. And the research that we conducted on that on that design phase was very important, because it was really a lot of research on the languages used, on the metaphors used. And it is something that I really love working on. And then with the visa project, we are also working, of course, with data analysts. For instance, we have been collaborating with Otto Mantegazza. Otto Mantegazza is a data analyst. And we have been working a lot together on the data that were available about visas and visa inequality, also to find the right angle. Because again, in data visualization, there are always choices that we have to do for the collection part, for the selection part, and the visualization part. And so we have been working a lot together on the angle that we wanted to use to talk about the issue and the topic.
Speaking of this project, The Heart and Minds, I'm curious. I know I've seen it, and I know that it's based on European migration data. Do you have plans on expanding it to, for example, US migration data? Is this part of a plan at some point?
The short answer is no. I often get asked the same questions in relation to visas, not because we don't want to, but it's because, I mean, again, it is sort of the expertise a little bit, or the space where we work is very much in Europe, in relation to some of the European trends, and also particularly migration from the neighboring regions, and so from Africa and Mediterranean region and the Middle East. We work very closely with colleagues in the US. Actually, the work on visa was inspired by a project called Visa Limbo. That also has a little bit of an element of design that started to monitor the time that it takes for US embassies to clear visas, which is one of the main issues when it comes to visas to the US. In Europe, we found out, it was actually more the cost and the rejection rates. So it's simply to do with, being realistic. I mean, when I say we don't, is that we are, at the moment, we're going to focus a little bit on certainly from the visa work on Schengen and the UK. And on public perception, that is, as a project is now finished, but there is sort of ongoing interest. And again, my colleagues at ODI who are working mostly on is actually ODI Europe in Brussels, that covers some of these issues. And again, the focus is a little bit on target, particularly with the new European Commission, to try to focus on the future holds in Europe, given also, instability in France and particularly the new Commission and post-Ukraine or not post or Ukraine. So it's just a matter of continuing to focus on areas where we have more expertise. But we are very much collaborating and in touch with colleagues and organizations that do similar work in the US. The other issue with the public perception work is that it was relying on mostly existing surveys carried out in both, in the European countries, and then coupled with in-country more specific research and engagement. And in the US is obviously it be a bit challenging for us being based here. I'm certainly interested in the movement of people as a global phenomenon, and I just have there is a need and a moment, and in fact a real urgency in relation to Africa to really get Europe to pay more attention, given some of the demographic trends on both continents. And so it's something that I continue to focus on. But as I said, with plenty of collaborations across the Atlantic.
I think just to build on Federica, you brought many examples of forms of design that you take into account when you are building your storytelling, your data storytelling. So you said about the mountains in order to be more of an alternative way of not only showing arrows and so on, and what that means in invasion maps and so on. You also brought the inspiration on data feminism book. I'm wondering if you can also share some more, like where do you go for inspirations when you're making the choices, as you said, no? It's always a trade-off, like what should I choose in order to represent the data I want the best way? If you can share a little bit more, how do you search for inspiration? Where do you go?
So first of all, when it's a project on commission, like I think that the first question I ask the clients is, how experimental do you want to get? Do you prefer to stick with classical representations? And I do that, of course. I have nothing against classical graphics. Or do you want to explore something different? And this is like my main, this division, this macro division is my first question. And then when and if they want to experiment a little bit more, I mean, I have this collection of images that I like. It's cliché, but nature is a huge inspiration of mine. I have Pinterest boards. I screenshot everything or save on every possible social media. Every time I see something that I'm attracted to, I just screenshot it or save it somehow. Especially images that are not part of the data visualization world, but that are part of the nature or art or illustrations. Something that I learned to do was to understand instinctually what are the shapes, the texture, the elements I'm visually attracted to, and how I could use them for my project. And for me, it's very helpful. First, look at the data, look at the story, and having in mind the macro structure of the data. And so if I have macro categories, if I have a trend line, so what is the macro, the skeleton of the data? And then when I look for inspiration, browsing through my catalog, I have already in mind the macro shape, the information the data could have, and then I know where to look for inspiration. So I would say I save everything I enjoy. That's my form of inspiration, the way in which and then through exhibitions or vintage books. But I have to say that having in mind the structure of the content is very important to me, because then I start understanding what kind of shapes I can go towards. The quick answer is I save everything I like, and then I go through all the things that I've saved.
Yeah, makes sense. That's great. Marta, you mentioned earlier that your kids will soon start voting, and the importance of them having other stories that they heard or they've seen in regards of migration. We know that anti-migrant narratives are full of misinformation. What do you believe is the role of your practice in pushing back against the public discourse? So what strategies have been most effective?
Thank you. This is a very interesting question, because it also allows me to explain how I actually try to divert a little bit to traditional ways of thinking about, for example, what do we do about, ever since I started working on migration, at every conversation somebody says, oh, we've got to change the narrative, right? We've got to change the narrative, we've got to do something in the narrative. So how do we do this? So let's stick with metaphors. And the first thing is that I don't push back, meaning that rather than sort of pushing, so you have this wave of lies coming to you. And as I said, in everything I've experienced before was a bit like pushing back with a little bit of truth to try to keep the lies away. Whereas one thing that I actually quite enjoy doing is I play a little bit with it. I play with the fiction. So those lies have a completely fictional story about what happens to people when they move. And we pick up this idea of telling the story and fiction and turn that into something beautiful and quite counterintuitive about the ugliness, the fear that that narrative creates, and come up. This is why this idea of the beauty of movement came to me. It's this idea that you don't push back, but you say something very different and something a little bit unexpected, right? You throw in a concept that you will not associate with what has been deliberately painted as a phenomenon of fear, of pain, of desperation, which is, it's a lot of things that are happening, but at the same time, then they create a sense of impossibility and a sense of detachment from what, can be done about it. And the other important thing is that actually goes back to what Federica was saying earlier about hearts and mind, that project, which of course is that we know that public perceptions of what's happening are driven by some of these narratives. They're not necessarily entrenched. I mean, time and time again, surveys find that people are far less negative, particularly when you are able to have a meaningful conversation and a pragmatic conversation about who migrants are, and people are not necessarily entrenched or negative or against. And in fact, a lot of the, when migration rises in public opinions as a problem, it normally goes hand in hand with electoral processes. In the UK, it's fascinating to see what happened around the Brexit campaign, and then all of a sudden people were not worried about migration anymore. So the first thing to do is to try to be a little bit smarter about it, and not to engage in a way, or try to avoid the avalanche of lies by sort of going out the mountain through a different path that allows to slowly but steadily to get there. To me, what matters more than anything on coming forward with an alternative to what is the dominant toxic narrative and the lies, rather than trying to fight something ugly and negative with something positive, is to try to do something different, which is to break down the fundamental premise of the narrative, which is the other is to be feared. Like the other, is the people who come your way and undermine your life or take away your spaces in your kid's school, or your queue, your space in the line in the queue for the doctor, almost to create a story about the movement of people that is, that just elicits a different kind of imagination. One thing that I often say, just to give a very concrete example of what it means, is that imagine how many of us have had some family members in the past who have moved from, say, a village in, somewhere perhaps in the countryside, and moved to the city to look for work. Now just imagine that there is a fictional border between the countryside and the city. Like somebody says, from this point on, you're not allowed. And that's often what this international migration is about. But the movement from one place to the next, not out of desperation necessarily, out of will, out of interest, out of curiosity, is what moved me, what might well be what moved you, Julia, and others, to go some places to do something different. And I want to claim back the normality, the natural aspect, which is one of the reasons why all these organic metaphors that we work with Federica, from trees to mountains to organic shapes, work so well, because it comes from within, is a natural and organic sort of response to us as human beings. So breaking down the barrier between us and them and creating a narrative of us is what I'm aiming to do, rather than, in a way, fight back against the lies.
Thank you for sharing that and for your important work. It's certainly important to me personally as an immigrant here in the U.S. and as a grandchild of refugees that you're addressing this, for migrants today and working on these issues. And I really like this idea of, like, rather than just directly being responding all the time to disinformation and things like that, it sounds like almost like being like water, right? Like you're kind of redirecting in that sense, and really finding new metaphors, as you were saying, like away from these invasion map kind of scenarios to something that is normalizing migration, because it is just a normal human activity. So as we wrap up our time together, I have a two-part question. One is just about the future of LAGO Collective. Could you share a preview, whether of an upcoming project or just a general direction you're going? And then could each of you, Federica and Marta, share with our listeners, our viewers, something that you want to recommend to them? It could be a piece of media, it could be a project, something that you haven't done, but it could be a book, a movie, anything else, just to recommend to our audience.
Okay, the future of LAGO. Let me again use a metaphor, the visual one. LAGO came from a place of curiosity from me, right? I almost saw, imagine you are walking, say, London or a city, or New York City, where there's not much space to build new things, and I almost like walking down the street, and I saw like a little space in the corner at the end of the street that looked like something could be built there in between other buildings, like an awkward space. And I thought, let me try to see if I can build something there. And in a way, sort of 2 years later, there is now a building there of some kind. Right? There is some foundations, and something has happened. And so it's interesting when you create an organization, you become an entrepreneur, there are all these expectations about, scaling up in size. And I go back to the fact that I want to make a difference in my own way. And so the future of LAGO is to build now on these foundations. I feel very, very strong to me. I have no doubt. And in a way, this conversation is just an example that this house is becoming a place for people to come and have conversations and drinks and parties. People are coming along from different disciplines, and in fact, it's a bit bigger than I thought, the space. And so, what's happening now is building on that. And so, the main thing that is that to be expected is that, again, going back to this idea of staying with an issue over time and make it travel a little bit further along the lines, is that this work on visa inequality has only just started. We're lucky that this is an area where some data is published every year. So expect sort of the launch of the next phase in late spring. And we also have support to actually expand the work to begin to build archives of individual stories and create more performances and more beautiful work out of the research and the data, but to really address this fundamental issue of passport inequality. And in fact, today is more interesting than ever, because we just had the announcement of the first African woman being the curator of the next Art Biennale in a year and a half time, where so Africa continues to be there at the heart of after the last couple of years of the Biennale. And so that's a perfect sort of moment in time to really make sure that we've addressed some of those issues, because otherwise a lot of the African artists that are going to have their work at the Biennale might not be able to be there. So that's a little bit longer term. We do have something, a couple of exciting things coming up around Salona Design Week in the spring. And then there is also a moment of interest that Federica maybe can tell you more about, as the Triennale in Milan this year will focus on inequality. And so we're also thinking about sort of engaging with this debate in the design space, where inequality is becoming of increasing interest. And then let me go back to my old world, the world of the international community and policy making. Even before we get to the next Art Biennale, which will focus again on Africa, there is the G20 in South Africa in a year's time, which is a really, comes after Indonesia and Brazil. So it's got high expectations on countries, on sort of low and middle income countries, driving a little bit the agenda. The African Union is now a permanent member of the G20. So a lot of the work we do, particularly with cities and particularly on urban economy and creative economy in Africa, has a moment of engagement around the G20. So the horizon is, I'll take the next Art Biennale as the medium horizon. We're going to try to rebalance visa inequality between now and then, with a particular focus on creatives from Africa who really are disproportionately affected by passport inequality as we speak. And all along, we'll work together with Federica and others to really make sure that design continues to drive the way we think about the solutions. My recommendations, I have one exhibition and 2 films. I'm a film person. I love going to the cinema. I love to go to cinema by myself during the day when I can.
I love that too.
2 films. Fremont, that was a 2023 film that tells the story of an Afghani refugee in a small city in the US. And it's beautiful because it challenges so many misconceptions about who a refugee is and what an Afghani woman looks like and does, and then connects it to the experience of long-term Chinese migrants in the US. And I think it's one of the most beautiful things I've seen on migration for a long time. And then Anatomy of a Fall, because it speaks to women and relationship with men in particular, in a way that really resonates with my experience. And then finally, I need to just double check to make sure I get the title right. I actually bumped into an exhibition last week. I was in Rome and I went to the Museum of Contemporary Art, mainly because I wanted to see I've never been to the building. I want to see the Zadig building. And there is an exhibition called Restless Architecture by Dillers, Scofidio and Renfro, so very much coming from a design space, that basically focuses on movement and architecture. And it investigates movement as an internal property of architecture. Buildings that change their configuration have mobile elements and swell or turn to welcome visitors. And I never thought about movement in architecture. And in fact, architecture is very much something that, creates things that don't move. And I thought it was beautifully curated, which is actually quite rare for museums in Rome. And I found it really inspiring. And so go see it.
Wonderful. Federica?
There are new angles I would love to work on, and we will work on. New angles about visas and visa inequality I want to talk about with LAGO, and this is something that Marta and I want to do in the next months. As she mentioned, I'm collaborating as an independent designer, in that case with Triennale, for the Triennale exhibition that it will be all around the inequalities topics and all the possible aspects, angles from which to observe the inequality subject. And then I love designing to talk about topics, but then I also love to talk about design, to talk about topics. So I love to talk about my designs to tackle issues and topics. And so it's something that I'm going to do very gladly with Marta and LAGO. Speaking about inspirations, there is a book that inspired, it's one of the things that inspired me the most in the last months. It's not a design-related book. It's Discourse of Self-Regard, that it's a selection of essays and speeches by Toni Morrison. And it's beautiful, of course. The essays and the speeches are incredibly brilliant. And there is a quote there is a sentence that I always love to quote. And it's about the repercussions of a rigid and unchanging language. And Toni Morrison wrote, "However moribund, it is not without effect, for it actively thwarts the intellect, stalls conscience, suppresses human potential. Unreceptive to interrogation, it cannot form or tolerate new ideas, shape other thoughts, tell another story, fill baffling silences." She was talking about written and spoken language here, of course, but I really think that the same concepts can be applied to my visual languages, to the languages of design and data visualization. And so this is something that I really love quoting every time I can.
Wonderful. What a beautiful way to close us out with Toni Morrison. Federica Fragapane and Marta Foresti, thank you for joining us on the AIGA Design Podcast, and thank you for tuning in. You can listen and subscribe to us wherever you get podcasts, or you can check out the video versions at the AIGA Design YouTube channel, where you can like and subscribe there as well. We'll see you in a future episode.